Welcome to The Happy Writer, a show about creating and sustaining a long-term author career. My name is Patty Jansen, writer of science fiction and fantasy. I've published independently since 2011. This show covers motivation, diversification, learning new skills, and your place in your career. Come on in and be happy. This episode of The Happy Writer is going to be about writing craft. Specifically, I'm going to talk about editing and editors. Do you need an editor? What kind of editor? Before I say anything else, I would like to make you aware that asking this simple question, should you get an editor or can you edit yourself, is one of the most divisive and emotionally fraught questions you can ask in a writing group. Ask the question, then take some popcorn and sit back to enjoy the parade of tut-tutting, you must absolutely do's, shaming, and vitriol scroll over your screen. Why is this? Well, for starters, there are a lot of vested interests in the subject of editing. Of course, it comes from people who are or have at one point considered themselves editors, and that describes a large percentage of writers. It invites comments from people who are on crusades to push their version of writing and their version of language. But it also comes from countless writers who have spent quite sizable amounts of money on editing. They are not prepared to seriously look at the question whether the money they spent was worth it in terms of getting extra sales, or whether they could have made do with less. The editing made them feel good, so they feel that everyone else should spend the same amount, and they like to dish dirt on those who question or don't see the need. It's not a pretty look. What is it to them that someone else makes a different decision about editing? Nothing. It's not their problem. But they give everyone a bad name. Maybe, but more likely not. If their badly edited book doesn't sell well, why should anyone chastise others for it? But the truth is, people do this. Be prepared. From an author's perspective, what sort of editing and how much do you really need? And that answer is going to be, as usual, it depends. First, let's go over the types of editing. There is developmental editing, which looks at your story structure, your character motivation, the internal logic of the story, and things like that. A good developmental editor is extremely expensive. They can be very useful, or it can be money completely wasted. If you have been around for a while, you may only get a developmental editor occasionally for a new project, or just to brush up on your plotting skills. A developmental editor can teach you how to structure a story, and some people are going to need this. No, let's backtrack on that. All people are going to need to learn this. Whether they use a paid editor for it is another question. You can. You might not need to if you spend the time. Spending money does not always benefit you if you also don't learn anything. Most self-published writers talk about editing as the process of taking out jumbled up and awkward sentences, and especially typos and grammatical errors. The editing profession refers to this type as either copy editing or line editing, and sometimes combines this with proofreading. You can get extremely technical about which is which, but it's enough to know that this type of editing looks after the flow of sentences and clarity, and usually combines it with spelling and grammar. Most self-published writers do only one pass of this, and refer to it simply as editing. So which of these types of editing should you get? Lots of people here would be screaming, all of them. But let's be honest, how much money should you spend on a manuscript? No, let's ask a different question. If I spend an extra $100 on this particular manuscript, is it then going to give me an extra $100 in sales? With some types of editing and some people, the answer is yes, especially if you're a beginning writer and have never gone through the whole writing group process, courses, critique groups and all that sort of stuff. Also, if you have never had much critique on your prose, it might be fine, but more likely than not it's stodgy and needs some crap beaten out of it. The most important thing to realize is that editing can enhance a good story. Editing can't fix or rescue a badly plotted, badly overwritten book in stodgy prose with wandering and confusing points of view and wooden characters. A good editor should tell you to go back and work on your manuscript a bit more before engaging them, but most editors also need to pay the bills, so they will just take your money. As I have said and will probably continue to say into eternity, it is of vital importance that you learn the basics of storytelling and you learn to craft sentences that are not going to confuse people or put them to sleep. This will likely require some training and effort on your part. An editor won't fix terminally stodgy prose. An editor will just go over and find the typos and hand it back to you with a "that's $400, thanks." And then your book doesn't sell. And then people tell you that it should be edited. And this is infuriating because you had it edited and you ticked the edited box. But most of the problems that stop readers from reading are not related to the type of editing you got. They are problems only you can fix. You use the editor to enhance the manuscript, not to write it on your behalf. You have to get a feeling for writing well and crafting stories and how to put characters on the page that are interesting and engaging. If you wander into writing critique groups, you may get the impression that writing quality can be determined by things like passive voice and the use of the word that or was. And it is, to an extent. What is important is that our sentences are reasonably tight, that they are not drowning in words that don't need to be there for any reason other than to describe what's happening and maybe give it a little bit of flavour. But the flavour part needs to be extremely sparse. Overdo it, and you will end up with unintelligible sentences that span over 10 lines. Be honest with yourself. You know how the sentence goes because you wrote it. But if you have to craft it that carefully, who else is going to read it? If you have a couple of sentences like that at the beginning of your book, the reader won't continue with the sample, let alone buy the book. Your prose has to be tight, it has to be functional, and has to be easy to read. If you break any of those things, you're going to lose a percentage of readers each time. You won't lose all of them, and you will even get some people to say that it's wonderful. But don't let yourself be distracted by those people, because if the book doesn't sell, even after you've done a lot of advertising, there is probably something you can improve about it. Can an editor help? Maybe, a little bit. But only if you get a good one and pay them. But there is a lot you can learn yourself. Strangely enough, the better the prose is, the more time someone else has to fix up little issues in logic or notice that there appears to be a character in the room you said wasn't there. Give someone a broad task, and they will do a little bit of all the different aspects. Give someone a defined, narrow task, and they will do a good job. If you've never been through any creative writing class, and you've never grappled with a person who wants to strike out every instance of that or was, then you should probably do this first. All those silly rules of creative writing exist for a reason. They're not actually rules, but people like to pretend that they are. But the principle behind them is sound. Cutting out the word that cuts down on sentence length, so it's easier to read. Cutting out on the use of the word something is making the prose more concise. Something is a very vague word, and if you could put a different word in its place that is more descriptive, it improves the text. Instead of saying, "she heard something," describe the type of sound. The same applies to other lists of taboo words. The reason behind banning them is almost always to make the prose clearer and shorter and more direct. No, you probably don't need to excise every instance of that out of your manuscript, but you could probably lose half of them. You've used the word that 50 times in the chapter. Readers were starting to feel a bit thatted out. So if you get rid of half of them because you feel that the other half contributes to the sentence, don't cut all of them because it will feel contrived. You don't get brownie points for cutting out every instance of the words on the bad list. If a word or structure exists in the English language, it means that you sometimes need it. Some words you need only in very specific circumstances, but we are not talking about words like that. Please do not get rid of all the instances of the offending words. This is all editing that you can do. You can do this through workshops, or you can get some writing software that analyzes your sentences and points out overused words, incorrectly used words, and words that are vague or could be replaced with something better. All this is work you should not hand to an editor. An editor will not fix this for you. If the suggested changes are that overwhelming, the editor you pay a few $100 will just fix the typos and probably won't do that efficiently because they're trying to cut through the bloated prose. Learn how not to write confusing and bloated sentences in the first place. After all of this, do you even need an editor at all? Well, someone needs to proofread your book and get rid of the last typos. There are plenty of writers out there who will give the manuscript to trusted friends for this task. Some do it themselves. But these are usually people with a lot of experience. The reality is this. You can spend extraordinary amounts of money on editing your book, and no one will have the heart to tell you that the story doesn't captivate, the characters don't resonate, and the plot doesn't stack up. They probably won't even tell you that your prose is hard to understand. But my reviews say the book needs editing. Readers will always find something. It is literally impossible to get all of the typos out of a book. Some readers also have very interesting views of language, especially if they live in a different continent from you. But the other day I was recording the audio of one of my books. A lot of people have read this book and have written reviews. No one mentioned that the book needed editing, but I found a number of small errors, a missing full stop, and a missing closing quote, 2 spaces, or a missing space, a mistyped word that was not picked up by the spell check because it also had a different meaning, small things like that. Does this diminish the reader's experience? Well, my readers hadn't commented on it. They certainly hadn't bought the book any less. If you get a reader who is very nitpicky, maybe they just felt like they had a bone to pick. The reality is that every manuscript has little errors, and those little errors are not worth spending another $400 to get out. You simply fix the typos if you discover any, and be done with it. Another reason not to read your reviews too much. I usually get a couple of long-time readers to look over the book before I publish it. I never ask them specifically, but they will always tell me about those little typos anyway. As a result, my manuscripts have been going out pretty clean. The bottom line is that getting a manuscript out the door with as few errors as possible is your responsibility. Shunting it off to an editor does not abrogate you from that responsibility, because even when the editor has looked at it, there will still be errors. Determining what kind of editor, if any, you're going to need depends on how much time you can spend on the book. If you're a beginning writer, I would advocate that you are on the side of getting more people involved. I would get someone to beta read. Whether you are in contact with any readers who are really good at this, or you would need to pay for this, that's up to you. A beta reader will comment on plot and the structure of the story. They probably won't tell you how to fix it, but that is up to you. I know that when you're just starting, this can be very daunting. Where do you find these people? Well, in that case, you should have gone back to your critique group. A very decent percentage of people, including myself, spent years in critique groups before we submitted our manuscript to traditional publishers. We are still in contact with those people, since many of those people have also started self-publishing. We are also in contact with our readers. Make your own circle, or just pay someone to do it. But then how do you know that they're good? Unfortunately, there is no way of telling. You can go by recommendations from fellow authors, but in this case I would always err on the side of not paying too much, because essentially you have no idea what you're doing. You need to learn where you, specifically, need to spend the money to make your writing and your process better. This is going to be different for everyone. Not every editor is going to work for everyone. This applies even in traditional publishing. I know plenty of writers who got their rights back from a traditional publisher and undid all the changes the publisher wanted to make the book into something the author had never intended. Traditional publishers are also likely not to reverse rights on books that sold really well, so that in itself tells you a story. The point about editing is that it is a process you have to feel and be happy with, and there are few absolutes. The only absolutes are the rules of grammar, and even they can be fudged because of what part of the world you're in or what style you write in. Language is a living thing and it changes all the time. What might not have been acceptable 10 years ago is much more acceptable now. Ultimately, language is the thing we use to communicate, and editing needs to enhance it so that it does that. It needs to communicate your vision, not someone else's, and it also needs to be able to be understood by your target audience. If you're writing very heavy, convoluted literary prose, you're going to restrict your audience, but maybe that was always your intention. If you're going to write books for teenagers who hang out on Wattpad, then many other rules apply. Your editing process and the people you engage to help you with it need to do two things. They need to understand the path you're on and your target audience, and you're probably engaging them to save time. But supposing you had no money at all to engage editors, and you heard about self-editing, I would still recommend that you get an editor just once to see if you're at all in the position that you can do this. You don't want to be one of those writers who gets a bunch of one-star reviews straight out of the gate because your sentences just don't make any sense. But there are pieces of software that can help you with your editing, and you can let your phone read out your book to you. This is a very good way of picking up inconsistencies and typos that your eyes just keep glossing over. Then you can use trusted friends. These can be people in real life, but they must be people who are also familiar with the genre you're writing in. Try to resist assistance from people who are trying to rewrite your manuscript for you. Even a seasoned editor who sees a lot of problems will just point the problems out to you on a separate sheet. They won't try to rewrite all your sentences. And if you have established a process that is working, resist the calls to spend an ever-increasing amount of money on editing. The reason why people pick up your book is because of the premise, and they keep reading because of the story and the characters. Editing can make a difference on those things, but it's quite unlikely, and the type of editing that's going to make changes in the story is probably not the one you can afford. Ultimately, an editor can make a book easier to read for people, but if the readers weren't going to enjoy the story, it doesn't make that much of a difference. Conversely, you'd be amazed to see how many errors and repeated words and that kind of stuff you can find in the bestsellers. When people are engaged, they really don't care that much. It kinda hurts to say this, but more than 10 years in the fiction writing space has made me see that it's true. Story trumps everything. People bellyache about the writing of bestsellers all the time, but what constitutes an effective writing style is highly subjective, and all an editor should do is iron out the mistakes and inconsistencies, and they should do so at a budget that makes sense for your particular book. Whether you pay for this or need someone else to do it is up to you. The point is that it needs to be done, and someone needs to spend the time doing this. All the rest is piddling in the margins. Thank you for listening to the Happy Writer Show. Check out links and other episodes on my website at pattyjansen.com and my YouTube channel.